Hello, everyone. Welcome out to the third installment of ActiGraph's webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about developing validated digital clinical endpoints with wearable sensors. I'm really excited about our webinar today, and I'm looking forward to engaging with Job Godino at UCSD, who we'll introduce in just a moment. We're going to just give everybody just a second to get settled in here. I still see a few people joining. Just some quick overview. Logistically, there's a little panel that you can click. There's an area where you can type in some questions. Feel free to type those in. We'll do our best to answer those as they come in if we have time. If not, we'll be sure to get back with you after the webinar and answer those questions. We'll do our best to address all those during this time, but if not, we'll definitely get back to you. I want to go ahead and start our webinar today. Introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Wyatt, the Chief Technology Officer here at ActiGraph, and I'm joined today by Job Godino. He's an assistant professor at University of California, San Diego. Job, you want to say hi? Make sure your audio is working there.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
So excited, Job, that you're joining me today, and looking forward to chatting about this really hot topic right now. I want to take just a second and do a quick introduction to ActiGraph. We try to do this just at the beginning of every webinar. I think we always have some new people joining us, but just very briefly, ActiGraph has been around since 2004. We're a global leader in the wearable hardware and software solutions industry for activity and sleep measurement. Our primary two markets you'll see there are academic research and clinical trials. We've got a lot of growth in the clinical trial area over the past few years. But prior to that, a lot of independent peer-reviewed publications in the academic domain. I've worked with a lot of universities developing systems and hardware and software to help provide objective measures to these researchers, and are fortunate enough to have been referenced in a lot of publications that do that. Our clinical trial research experience has grown. We're in about 60 trials worldwide today. Our real primary product is an ecosystem. It's not just a hardware solution. That provides the ability to measure activity and sleep and movement objectively in clinical trials. We believe in the future of algorithm and endpoint development. And so that point there is just kind of pointing to where we think the future of actigraphy and wearable sensing is heading. We believe that ActiGraph is positioned pretty well to help deliver on new meaningful endpoints for our customers. So just a little bit about us there. And just a reminder of what the big picture is today as we look at bringing in real-world evidence to make sense of what's going on in a patient's life. I think wearables are just one component that you see there in the top, but there are so many other aspects that play into painting the picture of applying real-world evidence and looking at real-world evidence as we look at patients in the real world and disease progression in their lives and other factors that play into their behaviors. And so as we talk today, I'm speaking specifically, about the wearable section, but just as a reminder, this is a large industry and there's a lot of components to that. But as we look specifically at those wearables, we've seen a lot of rapid growth. Today, this is a Carter Associates survey that I pulled, sponsored by Intel. We see that today we've got about 10 to 15% of trials that are using wearable technology. And by 2025, the expectation is that 70% of those will incorporate sensors. And so we believe that the future holds that every clinical trial will be informed by some type of digital on-body or off-body sensor that will provide some evidence to help show the value and efficacy of the drug. And when we look at this Validic survey, we see that a lot of key business drivers are behind that, patient outcomes being the primary. We want to do a better job of seeing objectively, are we helping our patients, and what does that look like? And I think if we look at the regulatory landscape that we play in, we can see the importance of that. We need the objectivity. Also efficiency. Tufts research shows us that it takes about $2.5 billion to develop a drug over an 8-year period. We believe there's a lot of opportunity for efficiencies there. And you can see the others that are there, and appreciate Validic letting us use this survey here. I'll take just a moment and introduce Job. So Job comes to us today from University of California, San Diego. Job does a lot of work around validation of really clinical outcomes and endpoints from wearable devices. And so, Job, if you want to just take a second and introduce yourself, I think it'd be great.
Yeah, I think I come at this from the perspective of valuing the validity of the measures from wearables, precisely because I think that they can improve our understanding of how a health intervention or a treatment or even a sort of a treatment device can improve the lives of individuals and populations. So a lot of my research really is grounded within the conduct and evaluation of really complex multimodal digital health technology interventions. And because they're very high resolution, measurement plays a really key role in the fidelity of the intervention itself. And then it necessitates that we have a lot of expertise in just measuring related but distinct metrics from wearable sensors. So we often get asked to speak with folks in pharma and even in sort of the tech industry on how to go about best creating metrics, creating novel metrics, and then validating ones that sort of the scientific community has deemed as valuable endpoints, things like moderate and vigorous physical activity, for example. So that's pretty much what I do on a daily basis.
Thanks, Job. And Job's going to provide an example here in just a few moments around how does he help pharma and academic research really, as he said, look at the validity and the accuracy of some of these endpoints that are being used in clinical studies. And so I'm excited to dive into that. But let me just kind of segue here into making the point around the importance of continuous monitoring. I think the best way to do that is to take a look at the landscape of widely used measures right now. And one example that helps paint that picture well is this idea of Parkinson's, for example. That's what the image is here, but also physical activity measures. If we look at that, I think we see that there are a lot of measurements that exist out there that are being used to sort of quantify disease progression. And some of these are subjective or semi-subjective measures, but they really lend themselves well to technology. I mean, we should have, for example, with the Parkinson's testing, some of this is the TAP test, as you see there. We should have a way, an accelerometry profile to sort of quantify that. And I think that we really at ActiGraph and other customers that we work with see a lot of potential and around how high resolution measurements can help inform these disease progressions in sort of an objective way. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting use case because we've been approached about really trying to create novel digital endpoints or even just events based on risk-based high resolution accelerometry. So, tremors being something that we should be able to detect, but also to highlight, when we look at just globally physical activity and sleep measurement, and we have this list of what are typically considered patient-reported outcomes or self-reported measures. The validity of these is highly suspect, particularly when we look at it in relation to an objective sensor. There's been now a few studies that have gotten a lot of attention where we have attempted to go ahead and quantify people's physical activity levels objectively with the sensor, and we see that people are meeting physical activity guidelines of 150 minutes of moderate and vigorous physical activity a week at a rate of about 5%. But when we look at that on their self-report, it's upwards of 30%. So there's this huge discrepancy between what people believe they're doing or are able to recall that they're doing, and then our sort of objectively assessed assessment of what they're actually doing. So, while I do think that there is a place for self-reported outcomes on things like physical activity and sleep, I more and more sort of see them as measuring something different, more of a perception as opposed to a reality. And then the great thing about using sensors or wearables is that while you can measure physical activity and sleep, you can also sort of do what you've alluded to, Jeremy, is try to go ahead and have more novel endpoints, more novel exposure measurements. So it's one of the sort of benefits.
Excellent. Yeah, it's good to learn, what's available out there and where it's heading. I stole this slide from Ray Dorsey, and I promised him I'd give him credit. Ray's a doctor up at University of Rochester, but it just paints the picture so beautifully. And since we're talking about Parkinson's, it's this idea that under the light, Albert Einstein made the realization that we can't see 85% of what's in our universe. We can only see, or 95%. We can only see about 5%. And the point here, the synonym is that we're doing these things that are under the light, and they're sort of subjective or semi-subjective measures. But there's all these other components outside of that we don't have visibility into today that we believe are really valuable in informing us where we're at with disease progression and giving us the ability to react to the patient in an appropriate fashion. And then I put together this slide just to kind of explain that in the context of the patient experience. And we've seen this too, and many of you who attended conferences have seen this idea that these dots represent, the day in the life of a patient who's dealing with some sort of chronic disease, 365 dots over a period of a year. If you look at the two green dots, hey, these are when they actually visit, the doctor. They go to see their primary care physician, or if they're in a clinical trial, maybe they have a couple of visits for that. And so what does that mean? Well, if we look at when they're actually feeling well, the green being, hey, I'm feeling great. I've done taking my medication consistently. The off being, hey, I'm off my medication, or I forgot to take it, or I'm just not doing well today. The visits themselves, although they provide an opportunity to interact with a doctor, they're just providing a point in time. We're missing the big picture, and I think with continuous objective monitoring, we're really going to speak to that patient experience. And by the way, the blue bars, just think of them as kind of the recall period, right? If I look backwards, and they're positioned wrong, but if I look backwards from the patient about 7 days, that's about all they can recall. And so if I ask them, hey, tell me about your past 7 days, well, we're pretty limited in what we can capture there.
Yeah, I think one of the important things about this too, Jeremy, is that historically we've just claimed that whatever we measure at those measurement visits is indicative of something that's representative of the everyday life of an individual or a patient. We sort of, if it's physical activity and sleep, we say, well, this window of observation is reflective of habitual. And that's an assumption, it's an extrapolation, and from a meta-science perspective, we fundamentally don't know what we're not measuring. So, while you can make that argument, and in some cases that might be true, I do think that, the future is one in which we are measuring everything that's happening to an individual in between these more potentially deep phenotyping measurement visits.
Yes, indeed. Well, let me jump into a poll here just to get the audience engaged, and I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And this is really just a question around, which type of measure have you had the most experience with in clinical research? And that'll just help us know our audience here today. So PRO, patient-reported outcomes, these are any measure, survey, or maybe a take-home diary, or maybe even a digital take-home diary. In-clinic interview assessments, sort of like the ones we talked about in the slide around Parkinson's surveys, for example, or physical activity surveys. Objective on-off body sensors, or no experience with any of these measures. So just give you guys a second to finish responding there. All right. Go ahead and close the poll, and then I'll share these results. So as you can see, wow, that's pretty interesting. Looks like patient-reported outcomes pretty popular, as well as objective on-off body measures. So, hey, Joe, we got a good audience today, good mix.
Yeah.
Group of people who have used these products. So that's helpful. And so for those of you who have experience, with these tools or with these products, I think today what we want to do is kind of dive in a little bit with you, a little deeper, and just talk about some of the specifics of what does it mean, what do we need to know about that, and around that context, this idea of verification and validation. Well, those two terms get mixed up a lot in software and hardware, and we deal with this daily here at ActiGraph. But what does it mean in the context of a digital endpoint or an actual outcome? And so let me just start out by saying this is Job's wheelhouse, and he's got a lot to say there. But from a technology verification standpoint, you've got to start with a quality system. And this is not a sales pitch. This is just a fact of how we need to get to a good outcome or good exposure. Before we ever get to the bottom right side of this slide where we're looking at a specific outcome, and by outcome we mean things like calories or MVPA or steps or a measure that you might expect from a wearable. Before we can ever get there, we need to understand that there's a verification pathway that the technology should respect. And these are things around, accelerometry. Am I sampling the data at the right rate? Am I respecting things like the Nyquist rate? Do I understand that the accelerometer is being clocked in a way that is not susceptible to drift over temperature? What about the filtering aspect? When we look at removing non-human movement, or when we look at just filtering the data out to respect signal processing facts and sampling, are we doing that in the right way? What type of calibration, which is not even discussed in this slide, are we doing? Is it anisotropic? Is it Cartesian? How's the data being stored, and how is that going to impact the ability to recall the data? That's just on the device. And then when we look at after we download the device, how is the data stored, and is there any processing that happens leading up to the actual interpretation, which is where Job comes in, right? I mean, this is his background, but Job, the point is here, it's important for technology vendors and the academic groups to work together to really say, hey, we tighten this thing down, because at some point, somebody at a regulatory body is going to ask us this question. And so it's important to get that perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can kind of talk about the exposure and outcome validation.
Yeah, I definitely think that sort of when it gets past the filtering into the interpretation, and by interpretation we're talking here about sort of the creation of a novel endpoint or a metric or an exposure, right? Getting to that point, the further away from the raw signal that we're measuring, inherently the more error we're going to be introducing, and then you have a real potential of introducing greater levels of bias depending on how the metric was developed. And that really is my sort of area of focus. It's less on the verification aspect. I'm more interested in these sorts of endpoints. People's heart rate, what is their activity intensity? Activity intensity really is kind of my favorite metric right now. And their overall activity level. But oftentimes we get asked questions about sleep efficiency and what sort of sleep metrics are most appropriate for characterizing 24-hour activity. Oftentimes we have conversations about, well, what are the best indicators or surrogate outcomes for sort of quality of life improvement? And in those cases, it actually might be something like a functional measure like steps, or a functional measure like flights of stairs. So when I look at this sort of slide of metrics, I think to myself, okay, well, how do we know how accurate all of these things are? If my device says, okay, it can measure my heart rate, how do I know that heart rate measurement is accurate? If it says that I'm expending a certain level of energy and then I'm calorie counting based on that level of energy expenditure, how do I know that that's going to work out to benefit me if my goal is to achieve weight loss? So there are many ways to approach this problem, and I've been in a lot of conversations with academic partners, with industry partners, pharma folks, on what is the best way to go about this. And I really do think that there's multiple ways, and this is just to set this up with sort of an example that I know that I've been asked recently. Jeremy, I bet you probably get a lot of questions like this. Where people come and they sort of say, are the kilocalories calculated on my wearable accurate or valid for a COPD population between the ages of 65 and 80 years old? They have a really specific use case, a specific population in which they're going to be doing a clinical trial, and they want to know whether or not the wearable can achieve their goals. So I often say, well, it definitely depends, and that's usually an unsatisfactory response. But then I sort of offer, well, there's ways to go about this, and you could start just by cherry picking the existing literature. Inevitably, there's going to be some evidence that you can point to that potentially supports your specific use case. However, if you don't believe that the evidence really should apply to your use case, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to make a convincing argument to an academic peer reviewer or someone who works at the FDA, someone sort of has regulatory oversight. So there is the con of this idea that the evidence doesn't always exist and it doesn't always apply to your specific use case. So then another pathway for this would be to just partner with the subject matter expert, during clinical development, or develop a phase prior to rolling out a clinical study in which you're collecting validation data on metrics that exist. And if you do that intelligently and really well structured, you can actually have the opportunity to go about developing novel digital endpoints that are specific to your use case. Because as I'll talk in a couple of slides, the methods that we use to go ahead and objectively or independently validate an existing metric, those same methods often can be used to ground truth new methods. And that'll make more sense if you're wondering what I'm talking about in a couple of slides. But the pros of this is that by partnering with a subject matter expert, you have the opportunity to work typically with teams that can operate somewhat independently. And having that independence and sort of critical eye towards what is being assessed and evaluated, I think makes a stronger case that a metric you're interested in is valid in the population that you're working with. One of the downsides to this is it always takes a little bit more time up front. It's definitely a little bit more costly than, well, not a little bit, probably a lot more costly than going through and just cherry picking existing literature. And then inevitably, there's always a risk of failure. Not everything can be measured accurately using a wearable. So the alternative to that and sort of partnership is doing it sort of through a self-funded pathway. And I've spoken with a lot of people about this as well. And while I think the primary benefit beyond partnering with a subject matter expert really is related to making unique label claims and having a stronger grasp of the intellectual property rights, I do think that it's probably more costly. It's either just as time consuming as partnering or potentially a little bit faster, but unlikely. And then the risk of failure is the same in either environment. So I can walk us through an example of, or actually, no, before I get to that example, this is actually a really good point that Jeremy actually pointed out to me, that there are recommendations for this development pipeway from an independent technology organization called CTTDI. Jeremy, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure, Joe. And just to jump back to the previous slide there, you've been involved in all of these options. Is that correct, Joe? I mean, you have
Well,
experience in all these.
I've definitely done the first two,
Uh-huh.
and then I've consulted about the last one.
Hmm.
And I think we've had the greatest success in the middle one, the partnering
Hmm.
with the subject matter expert and
Sure.
having that be a true collaboration. I have seen some groups that are really well run
Hmm.
and operate really effectively.
Interesting.
So the self-funding pathway works well, but ultimately, when you don't have some level of transparency or independence when you're conducting a validation study, it's just inherently less believable. Your
Yeah.
results are less believable. So having a partner, I think, makes the results a little bit more believable, and then the risks of failure are somewhat mitigated, and it's not
Yeah.
all on you.
So just to context that, so if we're just working with a partner and we get calls all the time, someone will say, hey, we want an endpoint that really informs specifically, just take for example, someone smoking. I want to try to identify that. A self-funded pathway would be, okay, we're going to work with you to really work to develop that method or that algorithm to detect specifically what you're looking for there,
Mhm.
rather than try to kind of find something out there and make it fit. Is that a good description there?
Yeah, and oftentimes for those sort of bespoke, really specific, novel digital endpoints, that kind of work is going to be necessary.
Hmm.
Recently, we were asked to think about how we would go about developing an algorithm to detect scratching events
Yeah.
in people with dermatitis. And that's the sort of thing where, yeah, okay, we definitely could set up that study, create that endpoint, but without some element of independent validation, without some element of sort of an iterative design and development process, it's just going to end up being less
Hmm.
believable. And then we run the risk of applying that algorithm to a real world setting in a new
Right.
population and
Right.
having it not actually work as
I
we
see.
intended or as we designed in the original development phase.
Interesting. Well, that's nothing new. And my point with this slide is really just to say a lot of you that are on the webinar today, you know the folks at Citi, We may have some of them on the webinar today. ActiGraph works with them pretty closely, but they're a public-private partnership between FDA and Duke University, as you can see on the right. And they're really, this team is really trying to drive adoption of these practices we're talking about, or these implementations that we're talking about. And they've developed this framework for developing novel endpoints. And as you can see, I won't go through all these, but we're really talking about steps A through D today so far. How do we determine what we're going to measure? Begin with the end in mind. What are we evaluating? Looking at the extent to whether that measurement is going to inform the endpoint. What about the error? And then how can we show that the assessment is what it claims to be? And so I think the best way to paint that is to do an example. Before we do that, let me just drop another poll here. I like to keep you guys engaged. And so let me launch this poll. So the question is, do you have any experience in validating novel digital measures? And so this idea of taking a novel measure that you're looking at, or using it specifically in a clinical trial that maybe doesn't exactly mirror what the output is, or maybe you're trying to bring those two closer together. Just interested in what the audience's experience there is. It'll help us. All right, so I'll go ahead and close that poll and share that info. And so you can see, looks like about 26%, fourth of you guys have some experience there, which is more than I expected. But the others, pretty high portion coming in your future. And so hopefully what we're going to talk about next will give you some context around, hey, when I get there, what can I anticipate? And so in that vein, Job, I'm going to turn it back over to you. This is a great validation project that you explained to me earlier. I thought it would be good to kind of include that in the presentation today. So go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, so this was we were approached by a group of researchers who are part of what's called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. And they're interested in measuring physical activity and sleep. And then they had some requirements. They sort of said, well, we want a continuous measure of 24-hour activity. This is actually, let me step back for a second. This is a study that's going to be done it is being done in 9 to 10-year-old kids. So they're recruited at the age of 9 and 10 years old, and then they're going to be followed up into their early 20s. So it's a prospective longitudinal cohort study. And we're really interested in brain development and drug use, along with how that is influenced by behavior and the environment. So physical activity and sleep are two important exposure measures that this group was interested in. And they really gravitated toward this notion that they want to have continuous measurement, and they want it to be over 24 hours, so we can characterize the entire sort of 24-hour spectrum of waking up and being in light activity, to sedentary, to moderately and vigorously active, and then moving into different stages of sleep. So with that sort of as their desire, they then sort of qualified it a little bit more and said, well, we want this to be low cost. We want this to be pretty non-invasive. We want to be able to have passive data upload. And then we want people to be able to do this for 3 months to a year at a time and have some element of it that is minimally engaging. So at the time that we were taking all these considerations into account, we sort of made the decision that, well, we have to operate within the consumer space for this. So we decided to go with the Fitbit Charge HR, which is a precursor to what we now have on the market as the Charge 3. So there was a Charge 2 in between the Charge HR and the Charge 3. But fundamentally, we had no idea whether or not the Fitbit Charge HR could measure physical activity, sleep, and heart rate in 9 and 10-year-old kids accurately. So the first stage was to design a validation study that would give us some sense of whether or not this device was measuring things accurately. So if you look at this child on the right here, she is wearing an indirect calorimeter from Cosmed. It's a K4 unit. It measures breath-to-breath gas exchange. She's also wearing on her left arm an ActiGraph link. And then under her shirt, she has a 3-lead ECG system on from Biopack. She, on her right wrist, has the device of interest, the Fitbit Charge HR. And actually, another interesting thing is mounted below that K4 unit that's on her stomach is a GoPro camera. And that GoPro recorded the entire measurement session so that every time that she took a step, we could have someone go in, watch that video, and count the number of steps that she took. And I don't know if we'll get to this, and probably shouldn't, but I'll just tell everyone that steps are my least favorite metric for various reasons. But I'll sort of highlight that in this protocol that we developed, we really wanted the protocol to be reflective of the sorts of activities that a 9 or 10-year-old child would do throughout a day. And then we wanted to focus on areas where we think that it's difficult for a wearable sensor to pick up specific metrics. So an example of this is the Fitbit Charge HR has a heart rate sensor and accelerometer in it. When there isn't motion, in theory, Fitbit could be using the heart rate sensor to infer higher levels of energy expenditure in the absence of a lot of motion. So the way we see whether or not that's happening is we put the 9 and 10-year-old kids on a stationary cycling erg, have a really controlled workload that we understand the intensity, we understand the caloric energy expenditure based on the indirect calorimetry, and then we say, okay, well, is the Charge HR able to measure the caloric energy expenditure the same way that our indirect calorimeter is? And it's kind of like, well, we know there's no ambulation, so any step that would be quantified by the Fitbit is definitely an error. So it's an environment where we have no motion, but we have a high energy expenditure and heart rate response. Can the device pick that up? Similarly, we did some sneaky things like have the kids walk on a treadmill at 3 miles per hour. Then we had them come off the treadmill. We put a backpack on them at about 15% of their body weight, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics sort of cut point for what they claim to be a safe level of weight to be carried in a backpack. And then we put them back onto the treadmill at the same speed. So in theory, their weight has just increased. They're carrying additional weight, so we know their energy expenditure is going up. Their heart rate should go up, but nothing about their acceleration profile, or very little about their acceleration profile, is changing. So in this environment, again, it's a way to sort of suss out, okay, can the Fitbit Charge HR pick up this subtlety of increased energy expenditure that we can measure from heart rate response and we can measure from indirect calorimetry? We then had sort of dynamic tasks where they walked up and down stairs, they walked outside along a 400-meter walkway, they did agility drills, and then we looked across all of these different tasks and we summarized all the different metrics that the Fitbit Charge HR purports to be measuring. So things like moderate and vigorous physical activity, light and sedentary activity, calories, heart rate, and the bane of my existence, steps. That was actually a torturous process because we had research interns go through and we actually had to use 3 of them. So 3 people had to watch the video, count the number of steps that they thought the individual took. Because defining a step in a dynamic space is really, really difficult, and humans are not good at doing it. So we had 3 people rate the number of steps, and we averaged the 2 that were closest together in order to see whether or not, it was accurate compared to the Fitbit Charge HR. So I'll just highlight one result here. It's the one that I'm most passionate about, and that is the moderate and vigorous physical activity versus sedentary and light activity. So when we classify these things, we see a precision in detecting moderate and vigorous physical activity at 85.4%. That's actually really, really good and is kind of on par with research grade accelerometry. So here we're starting to see indicators that some of the metrics, depending on how we cut them up, provide us with valid data. However, I know we're going to get into some of the trade-offs of this, and actually maybe that's a good way. I'll hold off on making this comment that's in my head right now for when we talk about the trade-offs. But this is how we go about doing this kind of validation study. And one of the things that I think it's important to highlight is that, in this use case, we had a research grade ActiGraph link on the non-dominant wrist, both for validation purposes, but also because we can go into that raw accelerometry data and we can actually create a whole slew of metrics, see how, and we can apply various algorithms and see which one comes out and gives us, the sort of believable metric compared to indirect calorimetry. And in theory, we as a group can also go into that raw data and process it over and over and over again with ever, newer metrics, and potentially create novel endpoints on our own. So this validation study gave us the opportunity to build the infrastructure and protocol to ground truth measures, but also allow us to go ahead and create an ecosystem in which we can create our own metrics.
That's a great study, Joe. Thanks for that overview and some really interesting results here. And you had mentioned some trade-offs, and just to kind of highlight those, I wanted to pop this section in our last 10 minutes or so here, just kind of look at the medical grade ecosystem versus consumer wearables. We've just seen a pretty good example of validation of a consumer wearable in a study. That comes with some challenges, right? And so if we look at some of those trade-offs, there are times when it's appropriate, I think, to have a consumer wearable, and there are other times when it's appropriate to have a medical grade device. And so, this slide just kind of points to some of those around patient engagement. You're not going to beat, an Apple Watch as far as engaging the consumer. The medical grade device is going to do what it's supposed to do there, focusing in on that measure. The ease of maintenance, the idea of having to charge a battery, sometimes more maintenance could be worse, but, consumer wearable is going to require that. Traceability of the data. If I want to be able to trace that data and provide the ability to show an auditor or someone who's going to come back and look at the data and say, hey, how do we show that this hasn't been tampered with? An ecosystem is going to provide a little bit more robustness around that. Same thing with control of the data. The medical grade component of that is going to be designed so that you've got control of that data. You can bring it in, you can monitor it. And then, of course, I think one of the most relevant is this body of evidence. We've talked about cherry picking literature or partnering with a subject matter expert. There's a large body of evidence around these medical grade devices that exist that allows you to pull from some of the knowledge that has already been done there. And so a good trade-off. I think consumer products.
Can I add something? I think that traceability of data thing and the control over data, those are two things that, really do often keep me up at night. We don't really have control. We have no control over a firmware update. So even if Apple or Fitbit, if they change the way they're going about calculating a metric in the middle of our study, and they push out a firmware update to do that, we don't really have control over that. Or as we're seeing now, actually, firsthand, we roll out the Fitbit Charge 2 in a population health study, and then that device is no longer supported and it gets replaced by the Charge 3. And really what we're doing is saying, well, our original validation on the Charge HR, those results should extrapolate to newer models. And in theory, as long as the technology is improving in the right direction, that should be true. But it's one that's more taken on faith as opposed to sort of evidence in hand.
Sure. If I look at the approach here of the ecosystem, that there's a lot of stakeholders involved in the development of the endpoint. Your patient, your sponsor, your CRO if it's a clinical study. And for us, we always see these things come up, Joe, where we've got the fit for use wearable, but there's all these other components that we're speaking to there. And so when we say medical grade ecosystem, I think it's important to frame that for the audience and just say, look, there's this idea of protocol specific configuration. If I expect a device to perform a certain way or have a certain firmware, I need a way to control that. Logistics and kitting, those things need to be considered. The cost of those, the cost of getting them wrong also. And then on the bottom, you see remote data capture. I think you and I talked about this idea of your worst nightmare being, a battery or, something, the patient loses a device with X months of data. That's catastrophic. I mean, so we need to consider those components in the frame of an ecosystem. So, quick last poll here for everybody. We're getting close to the end of our time, and so I want to drop this up there for you guys. So, what is the biggest challenge that you face or anticipate facing around deploying digital data collection technology in your studies? Is it patients' ability and willingness to use the tech? Is it your site, educate your site on that? Is it showing that the data is meaningful and worthwhile, which is kind of the topic today? Is it capturing all the data in your EDC? I mean, the EDC is designed to capture low-res data. You know, is that a concern or patient privacy? And I'll close the poll and share the results. And it's not a surprise there that the middle ground there is really, you know, showing that the data is meaningful. And Joe, good news, you're going to be employed for a while.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean,
For
we
sure.
get this
I
question
kind of
all
think
the time.
it's somewhat ironic, right? Because oftentimes in pharma research and population health research, we often use self-reported questionnaires. And because we have a rich history of doing that, because they've been psychometrically validated, I think people, you know, it's easier to sort of look at the history and say, well, other people have done it, therefore I'm okay doing it. However, when you scrutinize the validity of these sorts of measures, you quickly see that, you know, it's not the most robust environment. And then anything that's objective and sensor-based is I mean, again, depending on how far away from that raw signal you get, you know, you're not introducing as much bias or error. So the meaningfulness, the worthwhileness of it, to me, is inherent in more accurate measurement. But that's just my opinion.
Well, you mentioned the raw data, and you know, we promised in the webinar title to touch on this idea of the future of deep learning. And so I want to just tap on that here the last 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes of the webinar, and just point out a few things about raw data. Part of what that medical grade ecosystem is helping our clients do is to capture the raw data, and it provides some efficiency. And when I say efficiency, people scratch their head. What do you mean? Well, for us, we've seen a lot of clients that will capture the data once and then calculate over and over different applications on that data. So it's sort of like DNA in your blood. If you have the DNA, you can do a lot with that. And so for us, we really believe in the value and the efficiency of that raw data. We also believe deeply in the need for specificity. And Job, this is what we've seen you talk about today, is this idea that, you know, I need to calculate kcals, but hey, what flavor method are we talking about here? Are we talking about a COPD population or a CNS diseased patient? There's different ways to interpret kcals, and so the raw data sort of helps us inform the right method to get to the right answer. And there's some specificity there. And if you look at how FDA asks us to qualify digital biomarkers, they're heavy on the specificity and context of use, and so the raw data helps inform that. And then lastly, this idea that raw data informs advanced machine learning methods. The top line there is the traditional sort of, you know, let's capture the raw data, but I don't really care about that. Let's process it or reduce that data into something that's meaningful to us today. And those are your traditional measures of calories and steps and sleep, the things that we see a lot of products kind of putting out. We believe at ActiGraph that the future is going to be in these novel kind of algorithms and outcomes. And to get there, we've got to get that raw source signal, and we've got to get it right, because the data processing methods that are going to be applied to that are not your normal data reduction methods. They're sensitive to anomalies in the data. They're sensitive to poor signal processing methods. But the benefit of getting it right is that we have some new perspectives around endpoints that we've not even thought about yet. Energy envelopes is one that I've heard some discussions around, or clustering to identify posture. A lot of these are very sensitive to the integrity of the signal. And so, Job, your thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, even something like scratching events, right? That's going to be highly sensitive to the raw source signal, because it's something that doesn't have the highest magnitude of acceleration profile, but it, you know, is typically well patterned and consistent, but happens over a short period of time. So, you know, I think it's almost like this is where you really sort of highlight well this distinction between what you can do when you're in a research grade ecosystem versus a consumer level ecosystem. You can't even have this sort of conversation in the consumer level ecosystem. The only thing you can do in that arena is look at what they purport to be measuring in that traditional measurements box and try to ground truth it independently and verify that what they're claiming that they're measuring, they're actually measuring. You know, the moment that you want to truly create something novel is the moment where you need to have access to the sensors. You need to understand how they're taking a measurement, how they're data processing, and you need to be able to control a lot of that. So I think that really is, we definitely haven't sort of gotten everything that we can get out of a 9 degree of freedom movement sensor. We haven't achieved everything, so I think that there's still enormous potential within the high resolution wrist-based accelerometry, particularly when we start getting into both supervised and unsupervised machine learning and have really good ground truthing upon which to have really sort of advanced supervised machine learning.
Well, Job, I've got one more slide that has some questions on it. And before we get to these, and I'm going to leave them up for the audience to think about, it's 45 after the hour. If you need to taper off, that's okay. We'll take just a couple minutes here and answer some of these questions that have come in from the audience. So, Job, I had a few questions just around the validation study. People really interested in that. Is any of that public knowledge, or is that available?
Yeah, it's forthcoming in a peer-reviewed manuscript. I've presented on it at conferences, so I can actually, if anyone wants slides with that sort of the more detailed assessment of the outcomes. So we have analyzed everything from heart rate to MVPA to steps to kilocalories to intensity. So I can provide that to whoever until that paper is published.
Okay. Well, I'll take anyone that's interested in that paper. If you'll just follow us up in an email or drop a comment here, we'll do our best to get that to you. Of course, you can reach us at webinars@theactigraph.com or webinars@actigraphcorp.com. We can get that to you. Job, a couple of questions here. Just taking a look at, let's see, some interest that we're working with to correlate standard quality of life questionnaires to physiologic measurements. Please discuss others that are working on this, and is there any centralized effort that the community is working on that they can tap into? I don't know how to best answer that, but it sounds like a question you might be able to.
There are a lot of groups working on this. I mean, generally, if this is now being couched in the language of digital phenotyping, I've heard it couched in a more sort of engineering manner as creating a digital twin. But essentially what we're talking about is saying, okay, are there digital signals of our habitual behavior that are indicative of our quality of life? And I think that is still a fundamental question. And I think a lot of these digital phenotypes are going to be very specific to a particular disease case. For example, the ambulation profile of a post-pancreatic cancer surgery patient is probably going to be quite different than, or maybe similar to a post-bariatric surgery patient. But really understanding what is the sort of the digital phenotype pre and post an event, and then trying to infer and predict, what is, based on this sort of passively acquired data, can we see subclinical sort of changes in patterns of behavior that would be predictive of a readmission or some other need to, say, titrate medication dose for pain. These are all things that various groups across the country, I know most of them within the sort of academic research environment, and certainly at UCSD we do a lot of this work. I don't know of a sort of overarching effort to say, okay, this is how we're going to quantify quality of life based on a digital marker. And I think that even doing that construct of quality of life, that construct of well-being, is definitely going to be population specific and probably disease case specific. Yeah. So,
well, Job, I need to see people need to get out of here and see if you're dropping off, but I've got these questions I'd love to ask. I'm going to pick one here. Is that okay?
Okay,
I just want you to quick fire on this. We get these questions all the time. I mean, if we get a call, 10 a week, it's in 9 of these calls. And so just take the first one. How long should the device be worn to get a representative picture of the patient's behavior or lifestyle? So you got a clinical trial coming up or a clinical study, and we're trying to get a representative data without overburdening the patient. Just, hey, quick fire, what are your thoughts on that?
This is funny. This can't be a short answer. And it
Trying to
totally
pigeonhole you.
depends. It totally depends. I mean, we historically have assumed that, the 7 to 10 day window, with the representative amount of weekdays versus weekend days is representative of habitual lifestyle or habitual activity. However, we all know anecdotally that that can't be true. And we go through cycles of time and sort of cycles of where one week we do nothing and then the next week we do something, and even months at a time, right? So there's an enormous amount of variability in our 24-hour activity cycle. And we fundamentally at this time don't have really robust evidence that any sort of window of time is representative of habitual. We are working towards that actively. But if I sort of feet to the fire, what do I do in my studies? We always sort of have a window of time that goes between 7 and 14 days with a research grade device. And then if we're using a consumer level device, we sort of overlay that period either typically after we have a window of observation with a research grade device. It's a more conservative approach, but it's one that kind of gets us the best of both worlds.
Sure.
But that is an answerable question. The groups that are most well positioned to answer that question about representativeness are the groups that have done longer term measurement.
Yeah.
So if we can use an ActiGraph Insight and measure for 21 days and then deploy another one and measure for another and really get a sort of long window of observation, we can go in and randomly select windows, periods of days within that observation window and actually determine and say, well, if you were to randomly pick any 3-day window or any 5-day window or any 7-day window, that would give you the same variance as looking over the entire window of observation. So therefore, the minimum requirement would be 14 days.
Right.
And we've done that in Katrine Tudor-Locke has done a lot of this work within pedometers.
Yeah.
But still, it's 21. It's how many days within 21 days, and that seems unsatisfactory to me. So I feel like we really have to go a bit longer before we can concretely answer that. There are things that we justify based on history, and I think that if you were to justify it and sort of say your 7 to 10 day wear protocol, no one can argue that other people have done that and successfully detected meaningful differences.
Interesting. Well, Job, thanks for that. I'm going to wrap it up today, but just a reminder to everyone, if you want to work with Job or you want to work with myself, also, we have the opportunity to help you out together. It's kind of not really a plug, but just a fact. We do work with subject matter experts like Job, and if you're interested in learning more about how to do that, you can reach out to us here at webinars@actigraphcorp.com. Job, man, really honored to be on this with you today. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy guy. I appreciate your time. And same for the attendees today. We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to interacting with you guys soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeremy. I enjoyed this.
Thanks, Joe. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye.